The craftsmanship that it would take to make a bronze Roman dodecahedron would have been very challenging for a metal artisan to make at the time. 12 pentagonal faces. Music, 12 circular holes, no two the same size. 20 bronze knobs on the corners cast at a price that only makes sense for something important. Roughly 130 have come out of the ground across Britain, Gaul, and the Rhine, music, and almost none out of Italy, Greece, or Egypt. For 284 years, nobody could say what they were for. Is remarkable and unusual because there's not many more than 100 known to exist. Then someone stopped treating them as archaeology and fed the raw measurements to Grok AI, and the same proportion came back from workshops 1,000 miles and 2 centuries apart. Who set that number? The object nobody could name. So the Roman dodecahedron. Just look at that absolutely gorgeous object. Really intricately made. And there's a one over there for you. Look, if you're looking from that camera, a Roman dodeca is small enough to close a hand around. Hollow, cast in bronze or a copper alloy. 12 faces. Every face a pentagon. Every one of those 12 faces is pierced with a circular hole, and the holes differ in diameter. Within a single specimen, that variation is not scattered. It steps through sizes in an order that repeats. Every one of the 20 vertices, the points where 3 pentagons meet, carries a small spherical knob. Set it down on any face, and it stands on those knobs. Most examples stand between 4 and 11 centimeters tall. They weigh between roughly 35 and 580 g. Every specimen recovered with a clear archaeological context dates to the music same window, the 2nd to the 4th century AD. There is no inscription on any of them. No macaker mark, no sealed interior, no hidden compartment. The music object gives up everything it has to the eye in about 4 seconds. Which is exactly the problem. That deserves a pause because it inverts how archaeology usually works. Music. Most ancient mysteries are mysteries of absence. The tablet broken, the tomb looted, the scroll burned. Here, nothing is missing. Roughly 130 exist, and for 284 years, that abundance produced, music no answer. Rome makes the silence worse. It documented itself relentlessly in engineering manuals, surveying treatises, letters and insults scratched into plaster, and Roman writers describe tools nobody has ever found. Here is a tool found more than 100 times over, and not one surviving Roman sentence mentions. Music. The first was pulled from a field near Aston in Hertfordshire in 1739 and reported to the Society of Antiquaries. Music. The verdict was a shrug. Unmistakably Roman, entirely unidentifiable. There is still a huge amount of mystery around music, these very peculiar objects. But one of the most popular theories is that it had a more mystical function. Every find since has repeated it. Undeniable craftsmanship, undeniable expense, undeniable Roman origin. Music, and no explanation anywhere. Some came out of plowed fields and building foundations. Some surfaced in old collections whose provenance was already lost. And some were recovered from deliberate burial deposits, packed away alongside coins by someone who thought them worth hiding from whatever was coming. Whatever they were not disposable. Then, as the finds accumulated, a second pattern surfaced, not in the objects, in the map. A map that points somewhere. The dodecahedra do not spread evenly across the empire. They cluster, and the cluster has a shape. They appear in Roman Britain with notable frequency across Gaul, in what is now France, in the Germanic provinces along the Rhine and Danube, in the Alpine provinces, and in Pannonia covering modern Hungary. Now walk the other half of the map. They are effectively absent from Italy and Greece, from North Africa, Egypt and Syria, from the great provinces of the Eastern Mediterranean where Roman civilization was oldest, densest, and most heavily documented in surviving writing. That absence is the sharpest fact in the entire case, and it does most of the work. If the dodecahedron were a religious object or a status symbol, the Italian and Eastern heartlands are exactly where it should turn up because that is where the temples, the cults, and the money were. It does not turn up there. If it were an ordinary household implement, it should appear wherever Romans kept houses, which is everywhere. It does not. What it does is sit almost exclusively in the band of territory where Rome was still actively conquering, garrisoning, and engineering its way into difficult ground. It is common where Rome was building. It is close to invisible where Rome was simply music living. The honest caveat belongs here. Recovery is uneven across the Roman world. And in Britain, a legal framework funnels fines into public records. So part of the northern skew is modern reporting rather than ancient behavior. But the gap is too wide to be a filing artifact. Italy has been dug over obsessively for 4 centuries. If dodecahedra were lying there in numbers, they would have been found by now, which leaves a clue that nobody could spend. Distribution follows function. Whatever this object did, it was tied to the moving edge of the empire rather than its settled interior. And that has been visible in museum catalogs for generations, printed, mapped, available to anyone who cared to look. If a clue sitting in plain sight for 2 centuries does something to you, subscribe now, because the same thing turns out to be true of the answer itself, and it was hiding in the holes. Forged with deliberate precision and pure geometry, a dodecahedron is a solid with 12 flat faces. In the regular form, the one Plato tied to the cosmos itself and the time, every face is an identical regular pentagon. It is the 5th and strangest of the Platonic solids, and it carried real philosophical weight in the ancient world. The Roman objects are not regular dodecahedra in the strict sense. They are hollow. Every face is opened by a circular hole, and the holes vary in size in a controlled, repeating way. The vertices carry spherical knobs that add mass, change how the object sits in the hand, and give it fixed points to stand on or align against. They were produced by lost wax casting. A wax model is built by hand and coated in clay to form a mold. The assembly is heated until the wax runs out, leaving a cavity in the exact shape of the original. Molten metal goes in, and when it cools, the mold is broken away, followed by finishing work with files and abrasives. Nothing about that is casual. Lost wax casting destroys the model and the mold every single time. There is no reusable pattern, no shortcut, no second attempt from the same setup. Every dodecahedron that exists represents a wax original built from scratch by someone who knew how to lay out regular pentagons, music, and wrap 12 of them into a closed solid without the whole thing failing to meet. The materials were not lying around either. Copper and tin had to be mined, smelted, alloyed, and moved. And music, tin came from a handful of sources. A cast bronze object of any complexity represented a serious commitment of resources, one that could be reversed at any moment because scrap bronze was recycled constantly. Objects that lost their purpose went back into the crucible. That is quietly damning for half the theories. For roughly 130 of these to survive at all implies a great many more once existed, and that people kept them rather than melting them down. Nobody hoards a novelty, and they are not crude. The pentagonal faces are regular. The circular holes are cleanly cut and consistent in profile. The knobs are uniform. The overall geometry shows manufacturing control that required both mathematical understanding and genuine technical mastery. There is variation between specimens, and it is instructive. Sizes differ, weights differ, finish quality differs. These were not stamped out of one mold in one workshop. They were made repeatedly in different places by different hands across roughly 2 centuries. Different hands, same object, no shared mold. Which raises a question nobody thought to ask for 284 years music because everybody was busy asking a different one. 4 theories and how each one breaks. The explanations piled up. Dozens have been proposed, for have carried real weight, and each accounts for part of the object while contradicting another part. Start with the candle holder. The holes take candles of different diameters. The music knobs act as feet, and bronze shrugs off heat. It is possible, and a reported trace of wax residue in at least one specimen is the strongest card the theory holds. That report has never been broadly confirmed. And residue inside a hollow object buried for centuries is a fragile foundation for anything. Then ask what a candle holder needs. Music, it needs to hold a candle upright. It does not need regular pentagonal faces, controlled hole ratios, or a skilled bronze caster. When fired clay with a socket in it does the job for a fraction of the cost. And it does not need to avoid Italy where candles burned as brightly as they did on the Rhine. Music, the knitting theory conquered the internet. A researcher demonstrated on video that a dodecahedron can knit the fingers of gloves, the holes serving as frames. music, and the demonstration works. That is its power, and it's trapped because a thing being usable for a task is not evidence it was used for that task. A wine bottle makes a serviceable rolling pin. What sinks it is what has never been found. No fiber residue, no fragment of yarn, nowhere grooves of the kind, repeated tension leaves and soft metal on any specimen, music ever. Add the geography wrong for a domestic craft practiced across the whole empire, and then the arithmetic. Fingers vary continuously, so glove frames should too. The holes do not. They step in proportion in objects made hundreds of miles apart. The religious reading is harder to kill, and that is precisely its weakness. Plato's fifth solid, the shape of the heavens, an object of cult or divination, buried with valuables because it was sacred. It explains the geometric form better than any rival. It also explains anything else you put in front of it, because ritual absorbs inconvenient details rather than being constrained by them. And a theory that cannot fail cannot be tested. Press it on the details it should own, and it goes quiet. 12 openings of carefully differing sizes are not a symbol. They are a mechanism. Cult objects that survive are overwhelmingly carved, not cast at ruinous expense. And a Platonic emblem that appears on the militarized frontier, while avoiding the provinces where Platonic philosophy was taught, has its geography exactly backwards. Gaming pieces need the least discussion. Nobody commits that much metal and that much specialist labor to a token. And no Roman game whose rules survive requires anything of music the kind. Look at the shape of the failure. Every theory shuts one door and opens another. The form, the holes, the precision, the materials, music, the geography. Not one closes all five at once, and each new find made that worse. So, the object stayed unnamed, and the field kept reaching for domestic explanations, while the men who most plausibly carried these music things sat described in Roman writing the entire time. The man in music, the wet grass. Before the mathematics, one theory came closer than the rest. And music, it came from looking not at the object, but at what the empire physically was. Rome ran on infrastructure. Roads connected every corner of imperial territory, and they ran music famously almost aggressively straight. Aqueducts carried water across enormous distances on gradients so shallow they are hard to believe, dropping a few centimeters over a kilometer. Military camps were laid out to geometric templates. Colonies were planned on grids. The entire machinery of Roman power rested on the ability to measure, survey, and build accurately across unfamiliar and often hostile terrain. Picture one of the men who actually did that. A Roman land surveyor, an agromancer. Music standing at first light in conquered ground that has no roads yet, no boundaries, no order, wet grass, unfamiliar hills, a treant that could hide anything. A legion behind him, waiting for him to turn wilderness into a grid before the day is out. That pressure is the thing to hold on to. He is not a scholar in a library. He is a technician in hostile country who has to produce exact lines quickly. Lines that other men will lay permanent stone along, lines that cannot be wrong. Their profession is documented. A body of Roman surveying literature survives. The writings collected as the corpus of the agrimentures along with descriptions of their instruments. The groma, a cross-shaped device on a pole with plumb lines hanging from its arms, used to lay out perpendicular sight lines. The corybates, a long leveling bench described by Vuvius, used to establish gradients for water. Those tools are well attested, and fragments have been recovered, but there is no reason to assume they were the only instruments a surveyor carried. Surviving Roman technical writing is patchy and selective, and a man working under that pressure would want every aid he could get. The surveying theory proposes that the Dodecahedron were instruments of that kind. Rangefinders or calibration gauges or sighting. Music, devices used to fix angles and distances in the field. Both readings remain unproven, and it is worth saying so before the argument gets attractive. The principle behind the rangefinder version is not complicated. If you know the real size of a distant object and you know the angular size it occupies in your field of view, you can calculate how far away it is. That is basic trigonometry, and the Romans understood it. Hold the object at arm's length. Sight through the holes toward a reference of known height. A surveying pole or a standard staff. The hole that exactly frames it gives you a distance. Read off the instrument rather than worked out on the spot. This is the only reading that treats the varying holes as functional rather than decorative. It accounts for the precision because an instrument that is not precise is not an instrument. It accounts for the expense because measuring equipment is worth paying for, and it accounts for the geography exactly. A Roman legion on campaign was not only a fighting force. It was a mobile engineering corps building a fortified camp at Music, the end of nearly every day's advance. Cutting roads across hills and valleys, bridging rivers, and raising forts whose dimensions repeat recognizably from Britain to the Danube. None of that happens without measurement in the field. Fast and repeatable. Think about what that work demands in a tool, not accuracy alone. Anyone can be accurate slowly. It demands speed under pressure in bad weather, in country where you cannot stop to grind through arithmetic with a tree line at your back. Music. It demands that two surveyors in two provinces who will never meet get the same number from the same sighting so that a road one of them starts can be finished by the other and still arrive in the right place. That rules out anything fragile, anything slow, anything that depends on the individual judgment of the man holding it. It points at exactly the kind of object the Dodecahedron is: compact, rugged, cast in metal, and read rather than calculated. The objection has always been the same, and it is a fair one. No Roman text mentions such an instrument. No relief or mosaic shows a surveyor holding one, and Roman art does depict the chroma. Sighting through a hole at arm's length is unsteady work without a mount. Music, and no Dodecahedron has ever been found with a fitting for a pole. So the geography fits and the physics is plausible and nothing is settled. It is motive without a weapon. To get closer than that, somebody had to stop arguing about purpose and start measuring holes. The number in the bronze. The decisive move came from the direction the field had spent 3 centuries not looking. At the Politecnico Torino, physicist Amalia Sparavinia has published work treating these objects as geometry rather than culture, examining them as possible, measuring devices and asking what their dimensions would have to mean if they were. That work stands on its own in the ordinary published record, and it is not an AI result. The modern step is separate and should be described precisely. Documented measurements from specimen after specimen were run through Grok AI as pure numbers stripped of any archaeological label, with one blunt question attached. Are the hole diameters related to each other? So run it against the dead theories one last time. Candle holders would track whatever candles were locally available, and local supply is not consistent across 1,000 miles and 200 years. Knitting frames would track the fingers of the people wearing the gloves, which vary continuously. Gaming pieces would reflect arbitrary decorative choice, which is what arbitrary means. None of those produces a recurring ratio, a fixed proportional relationship reproduced across an empire by people who could not have coordinated, is not decoration and not folk. It is the behavior of a calibrated instrument, an object whose entire value depends on conforming to a shared standard. So that a reading taken with one is meaningful beside a reading taken with another 500 m away. Which raises the obvious problem. A standard has to come from somewhere, and somebody has to enforce it across an empire. The empire that agreed on numbers. Standards feel like a modern invention. Reference bars and temperature-controlled vaults, calibration certificates, tolerances written into contracts, music inspectors with gauges. It is tempting to file all of that under industrial modernity and assume the ancient world improvised. Rome could not afford to improvise, and the evidence lies all over Europe. Take bricks and music tiles. Roman building relied on standardized sizes, stamped in production, so that material fired at one kiln could be laid into a wall raised by men who had never visited it. A legion moving into new territory did not redesign its bathhouse around whatever the local yard felt like producing. It ordered to dimensions, and they held take milestones. A Roman mile meant the same distance in Northumberland as it did in Provence because the logistics of the empire depended on that being true. A unit that drifts from province to province is not a music unit. It is a rumor. Take the aqueducts, which are the hardest case and the most revealing. Channels were cut toward each other from opposite ends through hills and tunnels by crews who could not see one another's work, and they were expected to meet. not approximately meet with a gradient maintained across the join. Music shallow enough that water moved without tearing the channel apart. That is only possible if the surveying is done to a shared method with shared references, and if the men on both sides of the hill are producing numbers that mean music the same thing. Now put the frontier back into it. All of that is difficult in a settled province with roads and records on the edge of the empire. It has to happen in unfamiliar terrain, quickly, sometimes under threat by people who will be transferred long before the structure is finished. The margin for individual judgment drops to nothing, and what replaces it is standardization carried in the instrument itself, which is what the pattern in the holes would be if the reading holds. Not a decorative flourish that happened to recur, but the functional core of the thing. Music, a number somebody fixed and everybody obeyed. The trouble is that a pattern found in old, corroded, variously cleaned objects can always be an artifact of the damage. What the argument needed was one specimen that had never been touched. In June 2023, in a Lincolnshire field, someone put a tell into the ground and found it. The field at Norton Disney, a community excavation on agricultural land near Norton Disney. Volunteers from the Norton Disney History and Archaeology group doing the slow, unglamorous work that most digs actually consist of. And then a tool reaches something that is not soil and not stone. He stops. He clears the dirt by hand, the way you do when part of you already suspects what is under there. What comes up is a Roman Dodecahedron reported as the largest found in Britain and among the best preserved. All 12 faces present. All 20 knobs intact. Surfaces clean enough to scan at high resolution. For a volunteer on a community dig, that is the find of a lifetime arriving out of a plowed field. The people standing around that trench did not need a specialist to tell them what they were looking at. You can imagine the silence and then the music noise. The object went on public display at Lincoln Museum, and the group worked with academic partners to document it. Three-dimensional scanning produced a precise digital model, the kind that can be measured computationally at a resolution physical handling never allows. And this is where the geometry argument got the only test that could have destroyed it. Every pattern found in the existing corpus carried a quiet vulnerability. Those objects had spent centuries in soil, and corrosion concentrates exactly at the edges of a hole. Add the cleaning history. Specimens recovered in the 18th and 19th centuries were scrubbed, filed, and sometimes reshaped by people with no concept of conservation. Add measurement itself, taken with calipers by different researchers across 2 centuries at different points on an irregular edge to different levels of precision. Stack those 3 sources of error, and a genuine worry appears that the ratio was never Roman at all, but a ghost produced by damage and inconsistent recording. That objection cannot be answered by finding the pattern in more damaged objects because it applies to all of them equally. The Norton Disney specimen answers it because it fails on every count that would make it convenient. It came up near pristine, so the whole edges are close to what the caster left. It was scanned in 3 dimensions at high resolution, so the measurements do not depend on one person's hand and one person's judgment of where an edge is. It was recovered by volunteers on a community dig who were not looking for a mathematical relationship and had no stake in one. And it entered the record after the pattern had already been described, which means it is genuinely unseen data rather than part of the set the pattern was found in. That combination is what falsification requires. If the proportional